So I'm so glad that you're all here. I'm delighted that Kevin Young is back. I'm going to tell you a bit about the many things that he does, and then we'll talk about the many things that he does. So he is the director of the Schoenberg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York. He's the poetry editor of The New Yorker. He's written 13 books of poetry and prose. He's the editor of 9 others. Brown, which is the most recent book of poems, and his nonfiction book, Bunk, which is such a good title, which is all about hoaxes, and, well, the subtitle, The Rise of Hoaxes, Humbug, Plagiarists, Phonies, Postfacts, and Fake News. Both that and Brown were New York Times notable books, longlisted for the National Book Award. He is the university visiting professor at Emory and Baines Swigert professor at Princeton for fall 2019. He's a busy person. So we're delighted to have him here with us. How are you?
I'm good. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's nice to see you too.
Yeah. Congrats on your book review today.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I am. I had a review in the New York Times today, which
Yeah, it's very nice. For the
a
crying
banner
book,
day.
it was very good.
Yeah. God, my heart was beating so fast reading that.
See, I don't read them.
Oh, that's so smart.
I learned, yeah.
I'm going to learn from that eventually. I'm
Nah,
going to learn from
It's
that.
fine.
So we're talking about creativity and
Yeah.
sort of how we make things. And one of the things that I found myself thinking about as I was reading through some of your recent work is actually from your very recent work. You just wrote an essay about Ralph Ellison's Selected Letters.
Yeah.
That was in the New Yorker, and the thing that I loved about it was the opening, where you have this beautiful construction of all of these books that relate to fire in some way, have been destroyed by fire, made
Right.
valuable by fire, and of course thinking about Ellison's lost work to fire.
Yeah.
And I found myself wondering, oh, this is gorgeous. This is like, this could be its own crown of sonnets, you know? And I wondered, do you have in your brain little nodes of connections like that you sort of store away? Or did you find that writing this essay about Ellison's work called them all forward and connected them in this way that felt like this beautiful, necessary, vibrant beginning to the work?
Oh, big question right off the bat. I like it. I think it was a little of both, to be honest. I've been thinking about that, and truth be told, like some of those thoughts about fire had been coursing through a nonfiction thing that I'm thinking about working on, or I am working on. I'll be honest. But you know, I also woke up one. I literally was like, I think about to go to bed, and woke up, and I was like, that seems to me a way to get a handle on what's really a gigantic book, and also obviously a huge figure in Ralph Ellison. And Ellison's fire is so strange because he barely mentions it. He doesn't go back to the space for 8 months. He just kind of offhandedly to almost a stranger says, "Oh, I had a fire." And then again, he says 8 months later to his tailor, at the Andover shop in Harvard, which seems so strange. Anyway, that, oh, I had this fire, and I went back and saw it. But he doesn't really say, like, I lost a lot of pages. But in his mind, or at least and in the correspondence, the fire kind of gets larger and larger. So one of the aspects of that catalog that I mentioned that had issued a list of all these books destroyed by fire is a lot of them probably weren't, you know? So there was a kind of quality of that I wanted to capture, that, you know, sure, the ones that I mentioned are burned books, but there is a kind of quality of, it's sexier than saying, like, we lost it, or I just couldn't find this book, or, you know, like, it just never sold and we don't know what happened to it. And obviously Ellison's book is the most eagerly awaited second book, but it has the same kind of history of, you know, it wasn't as done as he wanted it to be, or we even had hoped it would be. And he was also sort of spinning his wheels in a way. And so it was a way to kind of get at his own creativity, but also his own stifled creativity.
Right, which is part of the process.
Yeah,
sometimes.
and you know, I had written about him before in terms of the shadow book, this idea I talk about in the Gray Album book of mine about lost books, you know. But I really wanted to visit it again and see what these letters told us about that.
Yes, and I love the moment where you talk about the tailor. It's so surprising, and it feels like a really wonderful sort of illustrative moment of what it's like to engage with somebody's papers in depth. And you see something that seems so significant and yet shows up in this unexpectedly small
Right.
way.
Yeah, and I read the letters sort of, over a few months, and I realize now how sort of rare they are, but because they're all in this giant book, you'd think being in archives I would know how rare these things are, but most of them aren't published. I've read a ton of Ellison and a ton about him, so to kind of see his own point of view over 1,000 pages is pretty wild. And he starts off really complaining to his mom a lot from college, and ends up, sort of writing these big long essays that he could never really write as fictions or even as essays sometimes.
Yeah. Beautiful. So I was thinking too about clusters of meaning associations that build up, and so fire was the first one that I noticed in thinking about what you've been writing lately, and then I was looking at brown, and I was thinking about that word brown and the poem brown, and I wondered how early on in writing that book that word and name came forward as a sort of nexus of constellation for you.
Yeah. Brown had a slightly different history than some of the books I've written. It didn't come all at once. It really was poem by poem. And I didn't know what it would be. I always wanted to write a poem about the fact that my church in Topeka, Kansas, where I lived for middle school and high school, was the same church that Linda Brown, the little girl in Brown v. Board, was. And so she played piano in that church. And so to have her there really was meaningful to me growing up, getting a sense of history in the sense of the Topeka School District's place in infamy, but also in the change that the Brown family and many other plaintiffs who sued helped integrate this land. So there was that always lurking for me, but it's hard to do. It's hard to write a poem about history, especially the way that history is always personal, but also the way that, for me, it was deeply personal. And I want to get it right and not get it wrong. And luckily, I've read it a few times in Topeka, and people from that church have said, that's what it was like, So that was one thing. But, really the first kind of Brown who came to me was James Brown. And he had died, and maybe I'll read that poem tomorrow or whatever, but he died like between Christmas and New Year's, and I saw a listing for him still about to play at B.B. King's, like on New Year's Eve, and I thought, like, what if he showed up? And so I ended up writing this poem about that. And so it seemed like all these other kinds of brownness, including John Brown, the what would you call him? The rabble-rousing anti-slavery, rebel. He was this figure that was kind of lurking over my childhood too in Kansas, he having gone there. So there was all these things that came up, and then of course I was interested in the idea of brownness writ large, and having a son who some of you know, who's now 13, but at the time he was like 10 or something. And I was writing these poems about my childhood, and I was thinking a lot about his childhood. And I was also thinking about the ways that boys his age were getting shot in the street. So it was really hard to kind of not write about that, even though I had told myself I would stop writing about him when he could talk, But he's forgiven me, I guess. So.
That's good. This is also advice that I need to store away for writing about one's child. Would you read that poem for us?
Which one?
The James Brown poem?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah? Because I'd love to talk about music with you too.
Yeah. It's called James Brown at B.B. King's on New Year's Eve. And the first line is a quote from James Brown. James Brown at B.B. King's on New Year's Eve. The one thing that can solve most our problems is dancing. And sweat, cold or not, and burnt ends of ribs or reason, of hair singed and singing. the hot comb's caress. Days after he dies, I see James Brown still scheduled to play B.B. King's come New Year's Eve, ringing it in, us falling to the floor like the famous glittering midnight ball drop, countdown, forehead full of sweat. Please, 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 begging on his knees. The night King was killed, shot by the Memphis Moan in a town where B.B. King sang, St. James in Boston tells the crowd, cool it. A riot on stage, heartache rehearsed, practice, don't dare be late or miss a note, or you'll find yourself fined $50, a fortune. Even the walls sweat. A godfather's confirmation suit, his holler, wide-collared, grits and greens. Encore. Exhausted after, collapsed, carried out, away, off, not on a gurney, no bedsheet over his bouffant, conch shining, but boots on, and a cape glittering bright as midnight or its train.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. There's this thing that happens in your poems where you imagine the dead going on in the world in some way.
This happens a lot.
Well, I'm thinking about
Scary.
No, not a lot, but I'm thinking about there's and this is on a more personal level, but there's a moment where you get a phone call. From a robotic voice, pretending that they've just heard from your father who's passed.
It's worse, it was a person.
Yes.
Yeah, saying, Paul, can you call me back about the cruise? I mean, that's what the person said. I can only laugh about it, but it was distressing.
I can imagine.
But I got my revenge because I'm a poet, so we take our time and then write a poem,
Yes.
So.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like we should issue warnings to people when we speak to them. Like, just so you know, if you start doing something, I'm a poet.
No. They have fair warning.
So you have this beautiful relationship with music that shows up in a lot of your poems. I was thinking about it in with Fishbone.
Oh yeah, Fishbone.
Yeah, which was I love the way that you connect with Fishbone through shoes.
Yeah.
And the sort of like subcultural style of shoes.
Sure.
Yeah. I was thinking about this because one of the sections of the poems, all of the sections are named after different kinds of shoes. There's Doc Martens, there's Fluvogs. That's when things get like a little too fancy, it seems like.
No, not then. Fluvogs in like '92, you'd save up, but they cost what Doc Martens cost.
Oh, okay. But then you also have Creepers.
Yes, Creepers.
Yeah. Would you explain?
Which are those pointy shoes with the big fat sole?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is just me asking you to do a service because I keep trying to explain Creepers to people because I've been thinking about them lately. Anyway.
Like new waivers wore them.
Yeah.
They come back like every 15 years.
Yeah, I think it was originally Teddy Boys.
Yeah, they were originally, they're kind of a version of those pointy like monk strap shoes that mods wore.
Yes. So what kind of shoes did you wear?
I did not wear Creepers sadly, but I wore all those other shoes, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
I still probably have them. That's the sad. Being an archivist of shoes is really tough, but my shoe archive is robust. But yeah, I mean, that poem, it's funny because I literally talk about in the poem finding their first record, and which was so important to me. And it was my copy of it. It was just floating around somewhere. And, from there, I just started connecting all these times I connected to this band, who are more obscure probably than ever now, sadly, but were really important sort of black punk, post-punk musicians. And they were terrific musicians. And then one time, as I explain in the poem, and now I don't really tell it as a story because it's a poem, I saved one of them from getting totally beat up. I mean, he got beat up a little, but me and my friend saved him in London. And so, but it's also about, I think, nostalgia, and a lot of the poems in that section, especially this poem, which I'll read from tomorrow, called De La Soul is Dead, are about like the past and that time and what it meant. And it was kind of strange for me to be writing about it like it was the past because it feels so present. But it was important too to kind of realize the distance that, you know, people, you know, it has a formal quality to it that though people dress sometimes like the 80s, they don't think about like these other, you know, cultural things that changed me at least.
Yeah. So this is also a moment of sort of being a poet who is moving through time, a poet who has a relationship to archives and history in the past, and then thinking about one's own life entering into that kind of space of being recalled from a greater distance.
Sure.
Yeah, yeah. I'm wondering about this relationship between creativity and the archives. How archival research can feel like a poem of its own, that sort of moving along, hoping to be surprised, not knowing what it is that is going to come up, but knowing that there will be something. And I was wondering if there are any archival experiences that you've had that have been especially generative, that have felt especially like that moment of discovery in a poem.
Sure. I mean, I think discovery is so important for all these things. I've been thinking about it a lot. As the Bain Swigert professor at Princeton, I'm teaching a class that's half at Princeton and half at the Schomburg Center, which I run. And being at Schomburg, it's fascinating to see, and I experienced this at Rose Library too, to see things through students' eyes, you know. Sometimes they play it a little cool, but often they don't, which is great, you know, because you're staring here at the Rose Library at the first edition of Leaves of Grass, which, you know, Whitman pulled off the type, we know, you know, pulled off the printer, we know. It's just incredible. You know, you're touching through time this artifact. But even more recent things, like at Schomburg, we have James Baldwin's papers in his personal archive. And in it is a great like set of notes for a novel, but it's on the back of he would go to a bar, I guess, and write, as one might, and he's written on the back of one that it says 2-drink minimum on the other side. And, you know, and he has this great penmanship, and he's drafting this late novel on it, you know, and I think for people visiting, it means it's so different and so powerful and immediate. We also have draft after draft of his first novel with many different names, many different, you know, kind of places it's going to go that it doesn't ultimately go, different titles. And that's, I think, really important, too, to see the process. So it's both discovery, I think, but also, to me, seeing that process of how a book or a poem or anything creative is made is really helpful, because especially as you're starting out as a writer, it can feel like you're the first person. I didn't know any writers when I was younger, certainly not any poets, and certainly not poets who were trying to write from a place that I felt like I was trying to write from, which was having parents who had come from the South and from Louisiana, and I hadn't seen my grandmother in a poem. And so my goal, which I don't think I knew it then, and I probably articulate to myself more now, is that I want to write a book that had her in it, you know, that she was in. Sometimes people say I want to write a book they can read. It wasn't so much that. I want to honor her in the way I knew how, which was to write poems about Louisiana and the way people talked and ate. And now I think the archive is very much like that. I think when I started in archives here at Emory in 2005, there was a sense that archives were these things that you would make sure no one saw, you know. And really now I think this is true across the board, but I think a lot of people in this room helped make that possible here at Emory, that it was so important that everyone experienced them.
Yes.
You know, and I think that was really a sea change in archives. I like to think that Emory was at the foreground of that. Certainly Schomburg has been for a long time thinking about that, but it's also a kind of change in libraries more largely, you know, because as you can imagine, a library and an archive especially is a place of not big change. It's not supposed to be. We don't even like the temperature or the humidity to change a lot. And so then to come in and say, hey, let's open this all up, and access is really important, discovery, if you will, made kind of formal, I think is really important. And that's where I think the field is. And to me, it's not unlike poetry. When there was a kind of snobbishness about poetry I don't think there was a particular time when there wasn't, but there had become a kind of like, this is good poetry, then the rest of it is bad, and the good poetry all felt kind of the same. And for me, the democratization of poetry from Whitman onward, from Langston Hughes and Gwendolyn Brooks and all these great figures is so important, and I see that too in archives.
I love that. I'm so glad that you all are thinking about that. I've only just recently sort of entered into archival research
Sure.
myself, and one can feel such a sense of it being at this sacred, forbidden space.
Yeah.
That you have to enter ritually and disrobe, and
I mean, I think it's sacred, but it's sacred in the way that like dancing is sacred. We're in a dance studio now, and at Schaumburg we have a dance party every first Friday. I'm going to miss Fridays, and it's really important, because to me it's like however you get people in that space is important, and if they see a piece of Baldwin along the way, or if they see Audre Lorde's this or that, it's really part of the experience of the archives. Because archives aren't only research, they're also an experience, I think.
Do you think people dance differently near different objects?
I mean, Langston Hughes's ashes are under our floor, so they better bring it. You can't just like ho hum, no talking on the dance floor. I say no parking. So you gotta throw down when you're there.
That's beautiful. Oh my goodness. Imagine spending your life, your afterlife, with a dance party happening over you every week. That's wow.
I think Hughes would approve.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great.
But yeah, I think of that as very sacred, but it doesn't mean it's, when people get married or like they dance after, because there's a ceremonial part, and certainly the culture I'm used to, that's part of one's pleasure, but also one's honoring, life.
Yeah, beautiful. So I'm new here.
Yes, but sort of.
I'm sort of new here.
Because you were here before.
Yeah, I was a fellow 10 years ago. But I came back last summer and spent some time with Lucille Clifton's papers here, which was glorious. And I think especially for that dailiness, seeing the calendars and just how busy she was with mundane things sometimes.
Sure.
But I was thinking about how you wrote an elegy for her that talks about being with the boxes of her work and holding that, and I could imagine that being a custodian of that work, and you in many ways you're a custodian of that work. It could feel very joyful and also a great sense of responsibility. I wonder how you navigate that.
Wow. Lucille is really special. She picked my first book, so I wouldn't be here without Lucille picking that, and generally being this figure who I think just embodies the best of sort of poetry and humanity, and she's a real survivor and a real able to think about the universe in a line. And I think that's really, what better is that for a poet? I feel like connected to her in many ways, and not least of which is I got her archive, which was the first archive I got when I was here at Emory, and also I packed it up. It was 100 boxes. I did have a bookseller come help me with some of it, but it was really like amazing to pack it. And I remember saying to her, looking over, and she was like, clearly like a little blue or something. And I said, well, how are you doing? And she said, I've been evicted twice in my life, and this feels like that. And it made me really aware of, I've said this before, that archives really are about people, they're not about boxes. And it's hard to remember that sometimes when you're amidst the boxes. But when she passed away, and which I think was to the day of her mother's passing, which was a big impact on her, and very, felt like not a coincidence. Sometime after, I got asked to do her collected poems, and so adding them, I just sat with my then research assistant grad student, and we just went through every page of her poetry, for 2 weeks straight. What a gift, what an honor, and it was a responsibility, but it was also a kind of, as you said, a kind of discovery. So it felt all the same to me. It didn't feel different. She always signed her books Joy, and it was important to me that when she said joy, she didn't mean like, don't worry, be happy. She was like, she was actually saying like, after all of this, remember that. And, Toy Derricott has the quote, joy is an act of resistance. And I think that very much that's what she was embodying in her work. And so to get to read it or to get to have it here, I think is really precious.
Yeah, you all should access that collection. It's extraordinary. Yeah, it's really lovely. I wanted, this is actually lovely because the editing kind of transitions into the next thing that I wanted to ask you about, which
Sure.
is the creative relationship between editing and your own creative practice. And I was thinking about it in particular with your editing of a book of Poems of Grief and Healing,
Yeah.
of elegy, and then the Book of Hours, in which you're grieving your father. And I was wondering how those processes intersected for you, what you learned from one that carried over to the other.
Sure. Well, I did the anthology after I probably had published the poems after, but I'd written a lot of them. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. And I had written about him in a book called Dear Darkness. Mm-hmm. And those were more immediate poems. A lot of them were odes to food and the food we ate together. And so they had this purposely, I think I was looking for a form, and the ode was a great form for me. And then I ended up editing the grief anthology, Art of Losing. And I learned a lot because there were a lot of poems in there that I had turned to. But then I discovered more, and then I sort of discovered how people write about grief now, which I think is different. Certainly I could have done a book that went back and thought about older elegies, but it seemed important to really not have anything too much older than Dickinson and really think about what's the modern relationship to grief. And as I say in the introduction, I sort of wished after my father died that we still had that tradition of wearing like a black armband, because you're in the airport, you're in a restaurant, and people are just rude to each other and not patient, and people are going through their stuff. And so there's a way in which those markers, I would say, of mourning, not just grief, because grief can be more private, but let's say mourning is the more public thing. We don't have good, common, solid, markers for that always. I was recently at Toni Morrison's memorial and gave out something there, a talk, and I was really moved by all these writers writing about her. And what I realized is how individual they were, how we each had some relationship to Morrison, some personal, some less so. But Edwidge Danticat talking about taking her or being given her hairpins, like just stands you on end. And I think those kind of rituals of keeping and keepsakes we kind of miss sometimes. And some of them are, in the archive. But at the same time, that's kind of the point of a poem, is it can, even more sometimes than a physical thing, it can keep a memory alive. It can also talk about those difficult moments, because grief, as you may know, is very complicated, and it's never done, but it's also changes. And so I think a poem does that better than, many other things. So I really want to gather in one place these things that help me. I've been pleased that people come up to me pretty regularly and tell me it helped them. And then I think I wanted, after that, I wrote or finished what became Book of Hours, and those poems, I wanted to have a different feel than those odes, and to be a bit more formal, though the form kind of fell away, and they were just left with what you're left with after grief, which is this formal feeling.
Emily Dickinson. Yeah. There's even within one of the poems, I think, a sort of a critique of some of the mourning rituals that are sort of cold and formulaic, like from a bereavement specialist.
Oh yeah, that's the same poem where I
Yeah.
talk about the cruise.
Yes, yeah. So it may be that the contemporary moment has some rituals of mourning, but they are unsuited.
I mean, that's not a ritual to
Yeah.
call up to the insurance company and have them stonewall you, you know?
Yes.
I mean, it might be a common practice, but,
But not
it doesn't
everywhere.
it's not enriching.
No, deeply not.
And I guess I think those are the weird modern frustration. My family, my father's side, all my grandparents, my father, they're all buried in not only the same funeral home, which has been there serving this black community in Louisiana for eons, but also, you know, the same parlor, the same literal room. You're like, back in this room again. Wow, you know, like that connection I think is really powerful. It can be strange and haunting, but it's also, you know that the Williams Funeral Home is there. It's a fact, and it would be weird if it sort of changed. And I don't think we totally have that often as Americans, a resting place. And so maybe that's one of the things I was trying to think about. And poems, I think, often provide some solace, some way of speaking back, but also reaching back.
Yeah. So reaching forward, what are you working on now?
Oh, you know, some stuff. You know, I have some poems that I'm mostly done with. I think will be out fairly soon. I don't know yet. I just sent some of them to my publisher. So, and those are a lot about going back to Louisiana. And so I might read some of those tomorrow. But, and those are just starting to appear in magazines, which is strange to send work out because obviously I read a lot of work at the New Yorker, so I'm very sensitive about how that process works, which always takes longer than you wish, but you know, I think at least from my end works fairly well, and you know, yeah, so that's what I'm working on.
All right. And of course, you're ongoing doing work with the New Yorker and discovering new poems for us every week.
Yeah. I've been really happy about the array of poets in there, and I think, you know, we get something like 40,000 submissions a year. I can never remember if that's submissions or poems. I think that's just submissions. So,
Oh, goodness.
but it's just a lot of people send there, which is great. I mean, I once years ago when Alice Quinn was the editor, I said, "Oh, it's how many do you get?" And she told me, you know, tens of thousands a year. And I said, "Oh man, that's so much." And she said, "I would worry if it was less, you know." And I think there's something about the New Yorker's long history. Like when Merwin died, he'd been in the magazine. Oh God, is it like 400 times or something like that?
Oh, wow.
Over 40 years. Maybe it's 250 times over 40 years. Some number that is just hard to imagine someone else being in that position. I mean, he's been publishing in the New Yorker since the 40s. And I think that was continuity, a bit like the archive, something that it surprised me, I think, when I went there. The kind of memorial function that you end up serving because so many poets appear there. But now I try to not embrace it, but understand it. And, you know, when Merwin died, being able to write about his time here at Emory and eating oysters with him. What I loved about him, and I tell this in the New Yorker piece, is he ordered his own dozen oysters. Like, we ordered oysters for, and he's like, "I'm getting my own over here." And just ate them, you know. But it was like, yeah, you should, you know. And I even knew then that was one of his last times coming to this mainland. You know, he's in Hawaii mostly. And so I think that was really special, and I think that the further you get from, say, the reading series I did when I was here, you start to see the way that, you know, a lot of those people aren't with us anymore, and these are, you know, Seamus died a few months later. So there's always that kind of memorial function, even if you don't know it's happening.
Yes. So you're inhabiting physical space in the current moment as well as this longer time of continuity.
Yeah.
I was wondering how that worked for you when, because there are some poems that you wrote that you actually traveled to do research for. Where is it? Yeah, Money Road.
Oh, yeah.
So Money Road is a poem for John T. Edge, and it also touches on the murder of Emmett Till. And I was wondering how working on a poem like that feels different to you than recollecting from memory, but actually like going to a place to make observations. And
Well, it wasn't planned in the sense that I was actually going there for research into another poem, which was this oratorio that the Southern Foodways Alliance had commissioned, to write about this waiter and a barkeep and also sort of activist in Greenwood, Mississippi, named Booker Wright. And Booker has it was on the news a while ago, and you can see it on, I think on YouTube, but on one of these streaming services, where he, as part of an NBC documentary, tells the menu at this place called Lusco's in Greenwood, and then they ask him, like, what's it like for you? And he describes, quite on purpose, what it's like and sort of the daily humiliations under Jim Crow that he experienced, and saying he just wants better for his kids. Pretty basic thing that got him pistol whipped by cops, got him fired from Lusco's, though some people said, Lusco's might not say it that way. And having eaten at Lusco's, which is still this old kind of steakhouse with prohibition curtains that you would pull, you feel this kind of history in it. And so I had gone there with John T. to look at that and to look at Booker's physical space, the bar he owned around the corner from Lusco's, but a world away. And we were there, and then I was like, let's, go see Emmett Till. It's 10 miles. Or not even Emmett Till, where he met his end. We're close there. And, somewhere after 2 minutes, it was like a pilgrimage. And so that poem is really an account of that pilgrimage, but I think it would be really different if I had planned it, but, once you start to drive to Emmett Till's grave and it starts to snow in Mississippi, you're like, well, it's about something else, and you just hope you can write something as good or as powerful as that experience. And so for me, to be able to try to capture some of that feeling, and again, I was writing in the midst of all these other incidents more recently, it seems really important to me. But it felt more like a pilgrimage than research.
Yeah.
It felt more like a journey than anything else. And the poems for John T., for many reasons, but not least of which because we were there together.
Are there any pilgrimages that you make when you're here to the Rose?
To the Rose certainly, but also I went to the taqueria. Yeah. So food mostly.
Food-related pilgrimages.
Yeah, it's a thing.
Well, I'd love for all of you to get a chance to ask questions of Kevin while he is here. If any of you, I know some of you are in creative writing classes yourself at the moment. If there are things that you're wondering about in your own work, questions that you're coming up against that you'd like another voice of wisdom to weigh in on, or food questions also.
Foodborne questions.
How much do you write it and rewrite it and rewrite it, or you just let it be?
A lot. I rewrite a lot. Very occasionally a poem comes more formed, but it never comes fully formed. And the more you write and the more you revise, the more chance you have of getting a freebie once in a while. But really, it's keeping at it. This is true of anything. I think if you play music, you have to practice. Jazz especially, if you're playing, I think of Sonny Rollins, the great jazz musician who would go on the Williamsburg Bridge. They said it was a Brooklyn Bridge, but that's not true. The writer changed it so to give him some cover. But he'd play on the Williamsburg Bridge. He had records already. He had albums. He was world acclaimed, but he decided he'd do what they call sabbaticals now. He had 2 sabbaticals where he stepped away from music and just practiced and practiced. And he came back and his music was different. And I think about that when I think, well, that line will be okay. And then you're like, no, I gotta keep at it, and I try to help people understand that, for me at least, the first draft, you have to be really kind to yourself and not be judging or just let it happen. So, that's really great I think, for a first draft. And then in subsequent drafts or edits, you have to have that demon editor come in and be a little bit ruthless, or a little bit at least gimlet-eyed and honest about what you're trying to get at or what that really sounds like. And I think the more you do it, at least in my opinion, it gets harder to love that first draft on the second draft, but you also, I think, learn to let that first draft happen. But really, that second part, they're not that different, and learning to befriend your demon editor, but make sure that person or figure, that side of you, is there, I think is really important.
Do you like take a day in between, or a week, or how?
Oh, like years, Yeah. Book of Hours, that book we were talking about, took 10 years to write. I probably had finished some of the poems, but I just didn't publish it for 10 years after my dad died, almost to the month. And that was purposeful. I wanted to not rush it. There wasn't a rush. It wasn't like I was writing about something that was going to change exactly. And the book even didn't change, but what that time did is give me time to live with the poems, live with what were really powerful memories as poems, but also at times to find the right form. There were poems that I remember literally taking from quatrains, 4-line stanzas, to tercets, 3-line stanzas, and suddenly it was a poem. It was like, something's off about this. And then just changing that, which, on our computers seems really easy, but I think is almost harder than when we used to type things up. You could be like, I'm going to play, it's just a piece of paper. But there's something permanent feeling almost about screens, even though it's easy to make them not. And I find if I'm trying to get something different, and this is true of prose and poetry, I'll look at it even on a different screen. I'll look at it on my phone, or I'll turn it into a PDF, and I'll look at it, and it has a different feeling, I don't think this is accidental, and I think that whatever you can do to kind of get back at that originalness and not just see it as a done thing is really important. And editors, whether they're your friend or an editor at a magazine or somewhere else, or I think reading your poem aloud to your dog can serve just the same purpose as airing it out and seeing, when people read and they stumble in the same place over and over again, there's something in that place that you need to go to and fix. So I try to find ways to get back at that energy, but you definitely have to keep changing. And time is a great editor too. So sometimes you'll write something that's perfect, of course, and you put it in a drawer or you put it on your desk and you walk away for any amount of time, and you come back and you go, there's all these other things that need to happen. One last example of that is I had a sonnet that I just kept kicking around, and I liked it as a sonnet, but I sent it maybe a couple places, no one would take it. And then I was like, God, there's something about this that I like. And I was like, maybe there's more of it. And then I ended up writing the sonnet sequence. And it's much better. It makes more sense as a start of a sequence, It's impossible to kind of edit your way into that, which is to say, looking at the actual thing, I couldn't have cut enough or rearranged enough, but I knew enough about sonnets and enough about sonnet sequences that it said, well, maybe there's something else there. And suddenly I was in this moment of memory and also form. And those things can often make up what a poem is.
Kevin, just on that question, for the sake of the students, you're traveling today and sometimes you're traveling. Can you talk about a day? Can you give us an idea of,
like now or my ideal day?
If you're in New York, or you sort of, I do feel like we talk about revision in these certain ways, and we're not lying, but I think it might be of use if you could tell us how you get things done.
I'm a terrible example is what I would say, the first thing I would say.
Are you a terrible example?
I am.
Or do you have how many books of poetry? Do you understand what I'm saying? Can you talk about that though?
Yeah, sure.
You might not be aware of it in the present tense, but if you were to look back on it,
Yeah.
what is a day like?
I think that especially in an academic setting, you have different amounts of time, and they don't always feel like that. Because some of it, there's a lot of energy you expend teaching. I mean, teaching is exhausting, and studenting can be too. I think for me, now I have less time, but in a way, when I do have time, say to write, or I have a couple hours, I really try to make the most of that. I think that sometimes people overestimate in terms of revising the amount of time they might need. I think half an hour, 45 minutes, whatever you have is better than nothing. This is probably true at the gym too, but less said about that, the better. But, you get more efficient after a while. And, I tend to, now in my current life, have tons of meetings, tons of places to go in the city even, and then evening things. So my time isn't what it is, but when I hit a weekend that I'm not traveling, or I hit like 3 days, I'll pull out like the various things I'm working on and try to move them forward, or read. Reading is working, and if you can figure out a physical place, even better for it. It can be a corner, it can be the library, it can be that place that no one's gonna bug you for X amount of time. And, I don't write on the subway, but people write on trains. I used to write a lot on the train whenever I would travel or something. And so I think you have to craft that time, and there's so many demands on our time now that the moment when and I like listening to music when I write, so I'll put on music or put on headphones. That really helps me. Going to a cafe, people love too, or places they serve stronger things. But, wherever you feel at home and can not be bugs, but maybe, have some food nearby, like sustenance for the journey. I think when I'm working without such demands, my day was, my ideal writing day would be, mess around till like 9:30, 10, then get in there and really start working in whatever space you have. And then remember to eat, and then sometime in the afternoon, like kind of knock off. But for me, that means like stop trying to go forward. I might have pages in my lap and be messing around. I can write with the TV on, so I might have that going. But you can't write all day and all night. You have to find that downtime, And to me, I remember something that Hemingway says in A Movable Feast, which is he says he knocks off the day when he knows what he's going to write the next day. And I think for prose, that can be really useful, because sometimes the temptation is to keep going past that. And you're like, I'm going to hit the unknown, at 7:30 at night or whatever. And you're like, actually, you're going to hit like some frustrated place that's going to send you off. And it's better to be like, I know I'm going to write. And then you wake up and you might be wrong. But I think that feeling overnight, which helps in your dreaming and your sort of off time, which is when you're deep in a project, not true. You're always kind of thinking of it. You never know. And then keep a pad by your bed. Oh, yeah, there and then.
I don't know if you ever encountered this, but if you do, how do you reconcile tension between being inspired to write about something, but feeling as though perhaps it's not your story to tell, or you don't have enough experience with that particular topic to write about?
That's a really good question. What does one do when you're confronted with something you want to write about, but you're not sure? I think there's many considerations, and you're asking, I think, the right questions. I can speak mostly from me, which is that I think that you have to have that same question when you're writing about your grandparents, for instance. There's still an ethical question about, like, am I able to? Now, this is the difference between writing about them, which you have to write about what you have to write about, and publishing that thing or putting it out there. So sometimes I think there's things that we might be ready to say to ourselves, but aren't really ready for the world. But I think you're also asking about sort of larger kind of cultural things. And to me, you have to be human and fearless, a little bit, and also open to the kind of questions and concerns that might come up from that. But I think those ethical concerns are there if you're writing about your grandparents or whatever. I knew, for instance, going back to college, that I was wanting to write about, and I had started writing about the Amistad Rebellion, the mutiny by enslaved people at sea in 1839, where they killed the captain and the cook, and they hijacked the ship to try to get back to Sierra Leone, where they were from. But they weren't seafaring folk; they were mostly inland peoples, and the they killed everyone but the captain and the cook. And the captain and the cook, they killed the captain and the cook. They saved their would-be slave owners, who then rerouted them by night. So they would go toward the rising sun in the day and then be rerouted by night. And this story I discovered from their letters, from jail, because they were arrested when they were eventually caught and decided whether or not they should go back to their would-be slave owners or to the Navy who found them. The choice wasn't like, let's let these people who were stolen from their homes free. So that really just captivated me. And I wrote a bunch of them. I wrote things using the letters. And then I realized there was this part I couldn't yet write. I didn't know what it was like to have a kid, much less to be ripped away from that person and never see them again. There were levels of grief or experience I just didn't have. And I didn't have a form to hold them. And I sort of looking for the form, I think, can really help, because if you find the form, you probably found the emotion too. But I couldn't find the right thing. And so I waited. I didn't throw those poems away. I put them in a drawer, and 20 years later, I ended up writing the rest of the story and published it. And 20 years is a long time. But it passed pretty fast because I was working on other stuff. It was just like something that was brewing back there. And then when I finally did start to write it, I was older and able to kind of write about it. So to me, there's the ethical question. There's the question of, do I have the skill and sympathies as a poet? The empathy question to do it. And then I think that empathy question goes to kind of, am I able to write about this? Do I understand enough? Or am I slipping into cliches, which you should be worried about anyway? But I think we're in a moment when there's much more awareness of these kinds of cliches that were predominant. How do you kind of write past that? It's something you should always be asking yourself, but I think is all the more important if you're writing about someone who isn't you, however that is.
So I think we have time for just one more, maybe two more.
Okay. No, there might be another. But ask your question, please.
I'll start. My name is Tom.
Okay.
I'm going to school here. I'm trying to become a writer, a poet. I'm taking classes and I've been told that you shouldn't write poetry for the sake of being published or for the sake of being remembered. You should just write
Okay.
what comes to you. And if this is true, if you mastered this because you've published a lot of things, but I was wondering if there was any conflict in working with archives and people who are renowned and people who have names that are just huge. I was wondering if, even though you maybe mastered the aforementioned, even though it's just an assumption, do you ever get an overwhelming fear or need to be remembered when you're among these great names?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think that one, poetry is strange because the stakes are so low. That's why people think poets all get along. It's like you don't know poets, but the stakes are so low. So it's like obscurity or immortality. I mean, that's pretty crazy stakes. I had the good fortune to work with poets who should be remembered, and some of them are remembered. I studied with Seamus Heaney and Denise Levertov, and poets who I think wrote a lot about where they were from, but also, I mean that not just physically, but also wrote about what made up poems. And I think being known or being remembered I remember them. Now, other people, of course, remember both these poets, and Seamus has such a presence here at Emory. And, for me, he was so important. But what he taught me is not to be remembered or immortality or something like that. He taught me how to be a poet in the world, just by example. Just like, I gave this reading in Iceland, and I was like, what? Like, you could give readings in Iceland? And it helped me know that there were other poets, that poets knew each other, and that poetry could connect across time. Whether one is remembered or not, one can't say, but one can connect with a poet across time. That's amazing. It's like the best form of time travel. It's so much more important than any of this other stuff. We're still reading Keats, we're still reading Dickinson, we're still reading Phyllis Wheatley. And as long as I'm around, I'll still be able to say their names, So being able to kind of think about your own personal connection to poets, I think is almost the most important thing. They get you through and they get you past some of the hurdles. And, any poet has rejections and rejection slips and experiences of people not necessarily responding to their work. And if you're lucky, you have other experiences too. But you have to remember that it's a process too, like publishing or like writing is a process. And to me, the important part is taking the long view and also trying to realize that, there's things that you can always change and improve on and work on, even now. And that's the fun thing. And if it's not fun in any way, because sometimes it's horrible, but if it's never fun, then, that's much more concerning to me than anything else. William Carlos Williams said, if it ain't a pleasure, it ain't a poem. And I think he's aware there's many different kinds of pleasure, cerebral ones, visceral ones, all these kind of aspects, but it has to have some aspect of that for you as a writer, not just as a reader. One last?
Yeah, I was just wondering if your collections are translated, and if so, if you have concerns about the way they're translated, or if you feel more like once they come out in another language, they're another thing, and let it be.
Well, you want them to be good, of course, yeah. My other languages aren't good enough really to always tell, but the first time I was translated was really into German, and I knew the translator, and I came and I read with him, and we did a kind of interesting reading where I would read the English first, he would read the German translation, then he'd read a German translation, and then I'd read the English. And this was long enough ago that not everyone spoke both languages who were there. Now I think you go to Berlin, it's like friggin' everyone speaks English. But so it was a very specific moment, but I could tell when people laughed that he had gotten some parts of certain poems. And his questions even that he asked me were really insightful, like, do you mean this exactly or that? And that experience was so wonderful as a young poet to see someone take your work, A, seriously, and B, to realize that you could have this life in another language. They recently just issued, I think it's Valparaiso, issued Book of Hours in Spanish. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm happy it's happened. Well, thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Eddie. Good to see you.